This is a sort of a landscape overview of a problem. It will be more titles than concrete things. Some ideas, some titles of things which in part have been done and in part have not been done, all connected to the question, what is agency in the physical world? So what's the problem? You decided to come here this morning, and as has been pointed out already, between things like deciding and acting and physics, there seems to be tension on which some of you have focused on things like agency appear to define determinism of classical physics, because to decide and act you have to think that the future is open, and if determinism is given, the future is equally fixed than the past, but is equally in contradiction with a probabilistic indeterminism of quantum mechanics, because the very idea of deciding is you're not flipping the coin, you're doing something else. Agency is time-oriented, fundamental physics is not. We act and we decide on the basis of things like mental state, desire, purposes, all things which are hard to place in a physical world. And when we think about us deciding, there is a first-person perspective, which again is hard to put in a physical world. So this is a general question that here at FQXi we often address. Agency in particular, I think it's interesting for a specific reason, which is makes it for me particularly interesting, which is today agency is playing an increasing role. It already did in the past, but today more, in foundational discourse. Here are a few examples. According to some people, this is Chris Fook, foundation of quantum theory, you have to think in terms of an agent dealing with information, doing something. There are some people, this is David Deutsch and Chiara Marletto and others, who use agency as a foundation for science as a whole. Science will tell you what can be done and what cannot be done in nature. There is somebody doing it. All over quantum information, and so many people here in this audience think in quantum information terms. There are always these funny characters, Alice and Bob and Charlie, and but not only them. Isn't the operators that do things on the state? There's always some agent acting on that. And this is not a modern thing, of course. If you go back in time, not to disparage these people the other way around, there are people like Kelvin and Maxwell. If you read the foundations, the way they talked about the foundation of thermodynamics is always what I can do to the system, what I can extract from the system, so there's always an agent outside. Is there anything wrong in all that? Of course not, unless you want to be foundational. Because if you are talking about foundation, you have to ask the question, who is the agent? And if you have a naturalistic perspective, the agent itself should be part of nature, and it should be possible to describe she, her, it, the agent, the agent, him, whatever, in terms of your own theory. So the question is, how is all this compatible with naturalism? It can only be if the agent itself is a bona fide physical system, is a system all the way through. So that's the question I'm posing. Is the agent a physical system? The answer on which I'm working is that I believe we should be able to think about the agent as a physical system. I believe this tension I started with physics can be resolved, but not so easily. It requires some work. It requires a number of steps, and that's the steps that I want to do a little bit more than listing. Now, to be clear, there are some solutions I'm not interested in. The first one is that there is something that does not supervene on physics, that contradicts physics. There's something outside. I know that in the audience some people are attached to this solution, but I'm not interested in it because it seems to me that there's no evidence here for the idea that is not just complex physics going on. Namely, that at equal physical situation, there could be something else which determines what is going to happen. The hypothesis that there is something wrong in our currently known fundamental physics that prevents us for understanding things like agency. Not because I think we know all the relevant fundamental physics. Obviously we don't. I do quantum gravity, so you don't have to convince me that we don't know all basic fundamental physics. But because these phenomena in which we're interested are well within the domain of validity that the theories, that the known theories, the theories we know have, and this domain of validities, we understand them well. So I don't see any evidence whatsoever that indicates that there isn't something else that simply, this is complicated and I have to work on it. But also, I'm not interested in a third option, which is widespread, which is we find around, which is just to say, let's define agency as a free decision that breaks, forget quantum mechanics for a while, that breaks physical determinism, but the world is physically determinist, therefore agency is an illusion, I forget about it, is not true. That I think, there's nothing wrong in this way of thinking, but that I think is stupid, because it just throws away the problem. You're not addressing the problem being what happens in the physical world, in concrete reality, when in the situations in which we say that there is somebody who just takes a decision, and somebody who decides to act. Now, let me come to, this is a subtle point, but I think it's a crucial point, especially with regard to the philosopher here. The thing we should not do is to give a definition of agency and then get confused about that because we find this in contradiction with the physical world. Because that's, it's creating a problem for ourselves. What we should do is define agency as what actually happened when we say somebody's deciding and see what is really happening. So the correct formulation of the problem is to ask what we are indicating when we say there is agency, and not to assume some metaphysical definition and then get confused about that, okay? This is a subtle point, but I think we constantly fall in this, I don't know if this is Wittgenstein 001, but it's let's not be trapped by our own assumptions, what we mean when we say something. My car has decided to brake. Well, you may say this doesn't capture the full meaning of deciding when we use it in a more narrow and focused sense, but we use that. The rover on Mars has decided to shut itself down because it has interpreted some clouds, it has detected a sign as possible incoming sandstorm. Here, again, we can say, well, this is not really deciding because it's a machine that is just acting in a predetermined way. Fine, but there are already many elements that were not there. There is some information coming in the machine, there is some elaboration of information, there is some comparing with internal states, some semantic there, because information has been interpreted as a sandstorm, and some decision with a purpose, not to be taken away by the winds and so on. The child has decided to wake up this morning. Now, children have a soul, at least since the end of the Middle Ages. So they can decide, but it's funny how somebody can decide while he was sleeping. I have decided not to criticize you, but then I lost my temper. Here I've decided something, but not acted upon. Now, let's go to something which we consider decide. This is something the people do experiments, put things in your brain always do. Decide which arm to raise freely. I decide my left. Kennedy decided to go for the moon. In some sort of philosophy of agency, agency is only defined when there's sort of spontaneous from nothing. So here's Kennedy taking a decision. And if you want to get rid of all the political thing, I've suddenly decided to jump up and go for Iran. This is a real decision, right? I have irrevocably decided to be permanently irresolute. I think many of you can identify in that. So in all these cases, one way or the other, some of all of this tension with physics comes in. And let me see how, starting, I now go for each one of these, and that will be the core of the talk. It breaks simple physical evolution. In a sense, this is the easiest, but also the key one. let's look at the easy case, the car. The car has decided to brake. What it means? It means that something has happened contrary to my expectations about the car, because I have a physical model of the car which wasn't supposed to brake, it was supposed to do certain things. Of course, it hasn't broken physical laws. What happened? I don't know. There was a crack in a metal of some joint, and the crack really slowly opened up, and at some point, boom, So what is happening here? What is happening is that there are two levels of description. There is a physical model of the car, which is incomplete, it's an approximation, and something happened in physics, but in a physics that was disregarded by the first level. There is a communication between levels, there is some interaction between different levels, so an approximation breaks down. Physics, this is completely clear, there is nothing mysterious about that. That's what we mean by the car has decided to brake. Now, I think that this is a universal situation when we talk about agency and deciding, including when we talk about decision about ourselves. Let's go back to the master, the great master. Everybody should read this book. I think if you take Spinoza, this is the way he put it. It's all over the book, but if you take, for instance, the appendix in part 1, in the mind there is no free will. Rather, the mind is caused to will this or that by a cause which is always caused by another, and this again by another, and so at infinity. Men, this is a key point, think themselves free because they are conscious of their choices, their desire, but they're ignorant of the causes that incline them want and to choose, and thus never give the faintest thought, even in their dreams, to those causes. In other words, men have an idea about themselves, this is very clear in Spinoza, have a model about themselves, can predict themselves, can understand themselves to some extent. Okay? Because they're far more complicated than their own capacity of making an idea in the sense of Spinoza about themselves, an understanding of themselves. There's a model, the model breaks down, where they make down, this is where is the freedom of decision. So every time there is an action, there is an interference between levels, and we talk about agency, we always need an approximation broken at some point, so two levels of description. As Sean Carroll would put it, all people in their reasonable mind would agree that the difference between past and future in physics is only thermodynamical. It's entropy growth. So hence the source of time orientation in agency must be thermodynamical because there's nothing else, and hence there must be a story, an account of how to go from the second law to the breaking of time reversal invariance of agency. Agency requires an open future. An open future, contrary to a fixed past, is for us such because we have memories. That's why the past is fixed for us. Memories, which are a human thing, exist in nature because in nature there are tracks. The future is fixed in nature outside our memories because there are tracks of the past and not of the future. Tracks exist because there's an entropy gradient. So first thing we need is a story between entropy gradient and track. This is exactly one of the two aims that Sean Carroll yesterday was presenting. This is also discussed in great book, in both books of Reichenbach on time, which I urge everybody to read if you're interested in that, including Sean, because I think there are key missing elements to the story there. I think that this can be, I share Sean's evaluation that we don't have total clarity on that, but we can be completely optimistic. We can be optimistic that this can be figured out. All right. So if there's an entropy gradient, where the entropy gradient come from? Well, because some lower past entropy yesterday come from even lower past entropy the day before yesterday. So you can track it down cosmologically, and then you need a story to understand, especially given that in our cosmological model, matter by itself appeared to be in equilibrium with the early universe. You need a story about how early low entropy evolved cosmologically. I'm not sure in current cosmology text the story is clear, but I think this can be clarified. There's a paper of mine on that, which was recent, which was very much based on some insight that David Wallace had some year ago, where exactly is the past low entropy and how it affects the gradient today. I'm not going into that. It's a story, but it's a piece of the story. And then the last bit of the story is why there was low entropy to start with. And that's a mysterious part. That's the one in which we are all confused. There are some ideas. I have some ideas which I talked at one of the FQXi meetings, maybe you remember them, in Tenerife, which is that the solution of this mystery is perspectival, is not the universe that was in a microstate, which is low entropy, because microstates have no entropy, is not the universe which is in a peculiar state. It's a coarse graining, which it is, and the coarse graining is determined by the coupling of the observing system to the rest. So it's a special observing system to which we belong. The way it's coupled to the rest, which is special and is what makes us special in some sense. I'm not going into that, but this is a reference. I don't seem to have convinced many people. I know that Anthony has an argument against that, which is a good argument. That's one possibility. Definitely, this is a mysterious. When we use decision in a narrow sense, in a more focused sense, we always decide with a name, which could be our fancy, could be moral, could be Epicurean, whatever you want. Okay? Where does this come from? We are not going to understand all the way agency unless we understand that. So, a necessary step is to understand purpose, value, meaning, and these kind of things. And here, you can account for meaning and value if you bring together appropriately and correctly two ingredients. One is the possibility of defining information in purely physical terms, which you do find in Shannon, as relative information, and you connect it with the specific way it plays into evolution in the following sense. The correlation, the physical correlation between a system, say an organism, and an environment are many, obviously. It's just all physics that correlate the two. Of those, there is a subset which is such that sort of have survival or have evolutionary value for the system itself, in the sense that if you evolve cutting them, the survival chances of the system diminish. Those are the ones that have value. Those are the ones that have meaning for the system. And obviously, it's not that everything which we call meaningful is directly traced to that, but this gives a sense of meaning out of which meaning grows on itself, and you can construct, you can understand what we mean by meaning. If this is so, when we say decide, in a narrow sense, so not the car that decide, but I decided to marry John instead of Jude, or Jane instead of Judith, it's always implicitly referring to biology or to some product of biology, like the Mars is, or to some analogous situation in which there is a Darwinian story behind. Last, I think that the key here is to separate into, a possible key here is to separate into two different problems. One is the experience, the subjective experience, the first-person experience of others, not me. And one is mine. If we confuse the two, we get confused, because we think we're talking about one thing, we're talking about two things. Why? Because the first one, okay, what is the experience of other? What's it like to be a bat? Is a psychological problem. We always, as humans, try to think what the other human thinks, right? I'm trying to think what Max is thinking now when he's talking. Yes, thank you, Anthony, to Anthony. And I'm trying to think what the audience, it's the audience following, it's not following, or I'm trying to guess you. That's what we do all the time. How does it feel to be a bat is my attempt to be in the mind of the bat. So my attempt to be in the mind of Max. I wish. So otherwise it's meaningless. There's no other meaning than this one, okay? The other step is myself. What do I mean by myself being a first subject? And here is the point. I think if we have a way of thinking of the first, the second is consequent to the first. It comes second, not first. So it's a byproduct of the first. Why? Because we are social animals. So we are others for others, and I think that the core of consciousness is a social story. This is where the origin of first-person perspective come. Let me put in another way. You all know this guy, right? I think, therefore I am. Read his book, where this comes out. This is the full story. I see the world, therefore the world. This is the book he wrote. I interact with other people, therefore other people. I see other people make mistakes. Therefore maybe I may make mistakes as well. Okay? Therefore I question myself to find mistakes. I question a lot. I start doubting. I doubt everything. I doubt. Therefore I think. I think. But if I think I am, so I think, therefore I am, in that book, is not a primary experience of a subject. Is a rival point of a long story of an intellectual with a human being in interaction. If you reverse it, a la Fichte, Hegel, Schelling, and you make it a primary experience, you're confusing the actual reality of things. Or, to put it in a way, this is actually also in Kant, the real story here is the following. My mom loves me, therefore I am. What does it mean? There is a regard of somebody else on me, the content of this regard, which I see in her eyes, that's me. What is the decision of other potential subject? Well, we just worked it out, right? There's no problem of direct problem of first-person perspective. It's a breaking of a certain approximation of the model I have others, which depend on a lot of things I don't control. Careful, not just things in the mind of the other person I don't control, but also things including the thermal fluctuation of a drop of water near to a neuron, which obstacles some neuron firing, at the end of which my thought goes some way that I marry Jude instead of Judith, okay? So decision is a complicated story which involves all sorts of levels, which go from the ones that we model as mental to the ones that we model as unconscious mental to the ones which are physical, has nothing to do with mental, but they all act when something happens inside ourselves. The incompleteness of our auto-representation, the body has, this is Damasia, incomplete homeostatic control of ourselves. And we have a brain that keep second-guessing and trying to figure out what happened in the mind of others, right? This is what our species more characteristically does. So I try to think what is the mind of Anthony, and I have a model which doesn't allow me to predict something. What I fail is his freedom, his soul. I use that. This is a sort of historical fable of the story. When I use that for thinking about the world, I naturally become a sort of pantheist. I interpret the sun, the god, the thunderstorm as agents that decided to hit me with something. Then I correct that because I have better models. And then I use the same idea for thinking about myself, because I have incomplete idea of myself, and because I have the idea of myself, which I read in the mind of others, that they have about myself. So the experience of deciding as opposite to acting like a machine is the indirect result of a projection of ourselves of the mental mechanisms we use to deal with the agency of the other members of our species. Okay, these are the steps which I think we should fill out to understand agency in physical terms. The first one is that we always have to realize that when we talk about agency, there are two levels. Okay, Alice, Bob, the quantum system. There is a quantum system, but there is also Alice and Bob. Yes, I just go through that. I think this is clear. There is a problem about initial low entropy. This is, I suggested the perspectival, but there's a full discussion to be done there. There's an account of how the initial entropy gives the current entropy gradient here, so the immense amount of free energy we have on Earth. This is understood. There is something to fill the kind of thing that Sean was talking about in going from the entropy gradient to tracks, and therefore obviously memory. There's a physical account of how evolution gave rise to how we call purpose, which I think the core ideas is clear. This has to be completed, but I don't think there is anything mysterious there. We need an account of how information elaborating system evolved to be such that the future depends on the information they stored, which is obvious to be done. And then there is a psychological account of what we need and feel when we talk about agency in ourselves or in the others. If we could feel all that, we would know what is agency in the physical world. Thank you.